This video lecture is on the bubonic plague, otherwise known as the Black Death. Remember, our essential question is, how did the events in Europe contribute to the decline of feudalism and the rise of democratic thought? The plague was brought to Europe through trade routes from Asia, and it reached the shores of Italy in about 1348. And this epidemic basically wiped out about 25 to 50% of Europe's population at the time. The plague apparently arrived in Europe by Genoese merchant ships, either from the Middle East or Asia, and it disembarked in Messina in Sicily in October of 1347. From Messina, the plague spread across Sicily and then moved northward, following the routes of trade. Florence, Genoa, and Pisa, with populations before the plague of nearly 100,000, suffered losses of 50 to 60%. By the end of 1348, the plague had crossed the Alps through the trade routes and was infecting the German states and spreading in England, where 1/3 of the population would die. Among those shouldering the blame for the catastrophe were the Jews, who were the object of violent riots, mob attacks, and characterized killings. Especially this went on in Germany. One of the worst was at Strassburg in 1349. By the end of 1349, the plague spread to northern Germany. The plague then entered the Baltic region by the middle of 1350. The plague had run its course as it entered the cold climates of the northern Baltic. Areas that lay outside the major trade routes, such as Bohemia, appear to have been virtually unaffected. Overall, the assessments of those who died range from 1/4 to 1/2 of the population of Europe. This would place the loss at between 19 and 38 million people. The total population of Europe at this time is estimated at 75 million.
The Plague Report with Gregor Smelly Peasant.
We're expecting severe outbreaks of the plague this year. Sweeping over on ships from Europe, it's expected to spread right across England. Towns and cities will be the worst affected, with people dying in vast numbers here, and indeed here. Better news up in Scotland, though. No plague whatsoever. So in summary, if you live in England, expect a nasty outbreak of coughing and weeping sores that ooze blood, followed by almost certain death. On a more positive note, tomorrow should be bright and sunny, perfect for that mass burial in a big stinky pit. Have a lovely year.
Those infected with the Black Plague broke out with red ring-shaped marks and with dark center spots on their arms and necks. They would run high fevers, and they would become even more ill as time went on, and they eventually would die. At this time, health knowledge was not very well known, so people would lock themselves indoors to protect themselves from getting the Black Plague, and of course they would try everything that they could possibly think of. So they would carry flowers to ward off the smell of the dead and the dying. The skies were filled with ashes as people burned houses filled with the dead, and even villages filled with the dead were burned down to contain and kill the disease. And even with that, nothing worked, obviously. And outbreaks of this disease seem to come in cycles. So, just as they thought that these people were no longer catching the plague, a new wave of the illness would hit towns and wipe out even more people in these villages. Because the population was not well educated, they didn't know that the infected rats were what was carrying this disease. At the time, they thought it was a punishment from God for being wicked and evil. They believed if you did something wrong or did something bad, you would catch the plague and die. Now, the towns were hit the hardest, of course, because there was no sanitation, and people were throwing their garbage on the street and not really caring what the smell was like, those type of things. And a rat coming off of a trading ship is seeing all this garbage around the floor and just was ready to run wild, and so their spread of the disease became more rampant. Medieval knowledge of health, hygiene, and medical practices were very limited at the time. Commoners and nobles alike took very infrequent baths. The peasants slept and worked in the same clothes for days and even weeks at a time without washing themselves or their clothes. The nobles were not much better. Soap was made of lye, which is very rough on the skin. There was no toothpaste or toothbrushes. People used watered spices on their lips and teeth, but all that did was briefly hide the smell of the rotting teeth. Peasants died young from malnutrition and the simplest of these diseases. Women died in childbirth from ignorance. People handled cattle and then directly handled food, so it was no wonder that their bodies were susceptible to catching the plague. Outbreaks of the plague continued for 200 years. You'll notice this picture is of a doctor who would treat the plague in later years. The cause of the plague was not discovered until the 20th century or the 1900s. Today, this disease is called the bubonic plague. We have a vaccine for the plague should an outbreak ever happen again, and we're lucky. Now, the people of the Middle Ages did not have vaccines to protect themselves from many diseases that we are protected from today.
Bring out your dead! Bring out your dead!
Here, will you take my Bert, will you?
Plague, was it?
Yeah, you will give him a proper burial, won't you?
Of course I will. I'll chuck him in a pit with all the others.
Oh, good, yeah, it's what he would have wanted. It's worrying, though, isn't it, this plague thing? You know, I mean, where did it come from?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that. It starts with a little flea that jumps upon a rat. It bites the rat and gives it germs, and for the rat, that's that. Then the flea, it looks for somewhere else to find its food. It hops on you and me and starts to suck our blood. First, you feel a little poorly, and then you start to swell. Then you start to spit some blood, and then you really smell. Then you know it's time to ring your funeral bell. Along comes Mr. Death and swishes you to hell. Gone. There's lots of cures to help you if you have the cash. Kill the village cats and dogs and burn them all to ash. Sit down in a sewer so the smell drives plague away. Place chicken bottoms on your spots, then you'll be okay. First, you feel a little poorly, and then you start to swell. Then you start to spit some blood, and then you really smell. Then you know it's time to ring your funeral bell. Along comes Mr. Death and swishes you to hell. Plague kills little children, even more than mums or dads. A priest said it's because the wicked kids have acted bad. Half the people on the earth are simply blown away. So for Mr. Death, these will be really busy days. First, you feel a little poorly, and then you start to swell. Then you start to spit some blood, and then you really smell. Then you know it's time to ring your funeral bell. Along comes Mr. Death and swishes you to hell. Along comes Mr. Death and swishes you to hell. Ring out your dead! Bring out your dead! Bring out your dead!
With keeping our essential question in mind, how did the causes of the plague, or the events in Europe, so in this case the plague, lead to the fall of feudalism? So one of the questions in your response questions here is, why was the plague called the Black Death? What were some of the common symptoms? How was the plague spread? And how did the outbreak of the bubonic plague in Europe contribute to the decline of feudalism and the rise of democratic